hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals Podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then take a moment to rate this show and add it to your favorite podcast player. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues. We invite you to come back for more stories and follow Marco Ciappelli on his social media as he continues musing on stories, storytelling, and storytellers.
And here we go. Welcome to another episode of ITSP Magazine's Audio Signal podcast. Sometimes I have to think about it because I do have a couple of different podcasts plus the coverage. But lately, I am enjoying very, very much the Audio Signal podcast because it allows me to meet new people. And it's just about talking about cybersecurity and the future of technology and artificial intelligence, which is fascinating. It's actually, I get to know people. I feel like after a podcast of half an hour, when you talk about stories and storytelling and a book that you wrote and your own reason why you're writing, it's kind of like, I'm not going to say you become a friend, but you get to know somebody pretty well. So today is actually my second podcast on Audio Signal. And I have the pleasure to be here with Ricardo. I'm going to do the old name, Ricardo Jose Gonzalez-Rothi. How about that? And we have been introduced by Raymond Paul Johnson. And guess he had such a good time that he decided to introduce me to a friend, which is Ricardo, which also happened to be a writer. And kind of like Ray, became a writer, and like actually many other authors that I talked to, once they get to the end of their career, or once they finally take a break from something that is very busy, that keep them busy 24/7 with their life and their job, and all of a sudden they have this story inside that they want to let it out, they want to share with the public. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today with Ricardo. So enough for me having this blah blah blah. I'm happy to have you on the show, Ricardo. Let's start with my favorite question, which is, who is Ricardo?
My name is Inigo Montoya. I love doing characters, but Marco, thank you for having me.
Of course.
I was so thrilled because I actually got to watch the podcast that you did with Ray Paul Johnson, and his book is a great book, and I just thoroughly enjoyed the to and fro format, that you didn't just talk about a book, but you talked about the parts of the engine and how it's made, and I think I enjoy how people do things. I guess if you had to summarize me, I am somebody who takes what I do very seriously, but I don't take myself very seriously. I came to this country from Cuba as a refugee when I was just about to turn 13 years old, and ran into a not real welcoming situation as a refugee in the Northeast. And being one I've always had a work ethic that my dad gave me. I just put my head to the plow and decided I wanted to move forward and be a good American. And so I have been very fortunate that this country has adopted me and given me all the opportunities, despite the fact that it's not always been easy. It's given me all the opportunities to really do something and be something. And a lot of people take that freedom for granted. It wasn't always easy, but it has just been a great privilege for me to have been adopted by Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. Yeah, I kind of, it's definitely a different story compared with yours. But, I've been adopted too. I chose it. Again, I wasn't forced to do so. Maybe like you had to. And you're going to tell us a little bit of that story, because what I understand is the book that you wrote is actually that story, and it's called the Mango Chronicle. And
yes.
And I'm pretty sure that it is, by reading the synopsis, the story about you. So the difference here, I usually ask, what is the story, and the story behind the storyteller. In this case, when I ask you about the story, you're actually going to tell me that at the same time. So that's going to be
it is a story about me, but it's really interesting because I had reached a point when I was very busy in academic medicine, and I did research, and I also did a lot of clinical work. So I didn't really have a lot of time, and it really occurred to me that my wife and 2 daughters, there were things about me that they would never know. So I started just kind of writing them down on pieces of paper, foolishly thinking. So as time went on, I started writing a few things on the side that were not medically related. And I had a few published. And then some people said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I have a tendency to mull on things. So like if I'm going to I like to build stuff with wood, and if I'm going to build something, I just think about it for several days, and then it crystallizes. I guess it's the way I do things. If I was giving a lecture to medical students, I just thought about what I was going to say for a few days, and then boom, one time it just all came together. So I decided to write this, and it took me 10 years.
Whatever it takes.
Not because I'm a slow writer, but because it was actually a healing process for me. And also I was so busy with clinical medicine that I just had no time to myself. So I would be 9 o'clock, and I would sit down to my computer and try to write something, and before 4:30 in the morning, and then I would say, I have to be at rounds at 7:30. And I was just exhausted.
Yeah.
So,
I get that feeling, and there is always something else that you can do. But tell me about this. When you have, first of all, I always like to say we're all made of stories, and there are some people that not only is made of story because it's been told stories, we watch movies, we listen to the radio, and even in our own everyday life, we tell story to each other. But some people, they have this story that they kind of need to share it. And is that what you felt into
no,
these 10 years?
Not really. I started to think, what would my wife and kids think about the fact that they didn't really know a lot about me when I was a kid growing up in Cuba, and that they might never have the opportunity to. So I was taking a night community college course, and the fellow that taught it was an old Austrian writer, and he was just a superb man. And he said, well, why don't you just write a sentence about something memorable? We call that a prompt now.
Right, yeah.
And so I would think back, and I would say, okay, well, what was something that I thought was memorable that I think my wife and my kids would want to know about me? And that's kind of how it started. And so some of these prompts I ended up writing as essays, and I had a few published. And then I started thinking about just how does that gel with my whole life? And I started kind of selectively picking at them. And then the theme of the mango came to me. And I love mangoes. There's 2 kinds of people in the world. There are people that love mangoes, and there are people that do not love mangoes. And ever since I was little, I love mangoes. And I used to go to my friend Juanito's farm in the town where I lived. My father was a grocery. He had a bodega. And most of his customers would come in from the countryside. They would actually bring their horse and tie it to my father's sidewalk. There were rings, and they would bring in stuff to barter with. So they would bring watermelons, and he would give them coffee and that sort of thing. And one of his good friends was a man who had a kid that was my age. His name was Juanito. So I would go to his farm, and he and I would climb up this mango tree, and we would sit up there in the branches, mangoes all around us, and we would just tell each other stories and eat mangoes till we were just really sick.
I was going to say.
And as I thought about all these things and what happened to me, I realized that I had a couple of friends that told me, you had a really Cuban Huck Finn childhood. And I did. And I started thinking back about the fact that here I was, I had a pretty good childhood. And all of a sudden I got yanked out of it.
Mm.
My childhood was yanked out of me. I had no control. One day my parents said, we got to go. You guys are, your grandfather's sick, your grandmother's sick, you have an uncle that can't get medications. He was an epileptic, and, we have to leave. We were not political people, but we realized that our freedoms, our day-to-day freedoms, were slipping away. Mm-hmm. And in the process of that, I come to this country. I end up in blue-collar New Jersey, in a very welcoming area. People would mock the way I didn't say things because I couldn't speak English. People asked me just totally ridiculous things, and I talk about this in the book.
Right. Don't give us too much.
No. And so I started to realize that when I first came here, I felt really out of place. The place in New Jersey looked different, the streets, the houses. And I started really having a lot of nostalgia. And I kept thinking about Juanito and me up in the mango tree. And so that became kind of a metaphor and an arc for the book. That's kind of how it got started. And the first half of it is mostly written, and I very deliberately did this in the perspective of a kid my age, that age. And then kind of the second half is more kind of as an adult looking back and going back and forth to how those things affected me.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever got an opportunity to go back and see if that tree is still there?
Yes. I went back in 2009 and in 2016. And I wish I could tell you it was easy. Mm. It was heart-wrenching. But I have to tell you something. The first time I went, I had been away for 40 plus years. I landed in Havana. The plane opens up its doors, and I walk out, and I take a deep breath, and I could smell the salty air and the perfume of a lot of the trees, and I said, I'm home. Hmm. And I started to cry. And the guy who was with me said, what's going on? I said,
right.
I'm okay. And it was okay in a good way. And then when I went back in 2016, I was really lucky because I had really been working on getting the book finished, but I got to take my wife, my two daughters, and my sons-in-law. We all went. So we got to really spend a few days, and I found my house, the house that we had to leave behind to the government. And there's a chapter in there that talks about that. That was a very hard, bittersweet thing. And I left. I came back here. So Yes, I was very fortunate that I had the opportunity to do that.
This was after the second time you went, was after you finished the book.
I had almost finished the book.
Almost finished.
It was in 2016.
Right.
I finished the book probably in 2018, 2020.
Now, the reason why I'm asking you this is because I'm a very visual person, so I can see you getting out of the plane and get emotional, remembering the smell and of the land. And I'm thinking, like, the second time that you went, you had all this time to remember things, to reprocess. Because when you write, I mean, as you know, Hemingway used to say, you just open a vein and start bleeding, right?
Yeah.
you bleed your soul into.
That's true.
And so I think that a lot of things came back into your memory.
I'm glad you asked me that, because in those 2 years after I came back, I had the backbone of the book put together, and it turns out that as I started writing and thinking about it, several concepts came. And there's actually 2 chapters. One is titled Remembering to Forget. And I started really getting a little bit philosophical about that in the span of the 2 trips. And it became obvious to me that when I was really having a rough time here in the United States, we had nothing. I mean, my mom was a teacher in Cuba, and she ended up working in the United States cleaning bedpans in a hospital in the graveyard shift. And my father, he was he owned his own grocery store in Cuba. He ended up getting a job as a kind of a glorified cashier in a Latin market. So we really struggled and had a bit of some really bumpy times. And I think you'll find that many people who leave their country as refugees always hear from their parents or whatever, well, when we go back, things will be better. We'll go back. And after a couple of years, I realized we weren't going to be able to go back. Things weren't going to get better. So I started deliberately remembering to forget. I didn't pay attention to what was going on in Cuba. I just said, I got to learn English. I got to work hard. I used to run track. I worked on that. I worked on my schooling. And I didn't even bother to think about the politics. I ended up going to college. I was very fortunate. And that sort of selective blindness allowed me to not wallow in nostalgia, okay? Mm-hmm. Which is something that, nostalgia, as you know, is good, but it can become malignant if you get paralyzed by it. The other aspect of it, in between those 2 years that when I finished it and I had my second trip to Cuba, was that I had to realize that I had to remember to forgive. And that was a really difficult process. And remembering to forgive means that you don't become judgmental, that people will say bad things about you, people will mock you. And you have to remember to forgive, because a lot of prejudice, as you know, is ignorance. And so those 2 concepts were actually woven in after my second trip to Cuba. And they were very helpful in really kind of putting the last touches on the book.
Did you have to forgive people in Cuba, or did you have to forgive people in the U.S.? Or
both? Both. My mother was, she lived to be 98. She had become very senile in her later years. And she would have some of these episodes where there were glimpses of, like, when it's cloudy and there's a cloud that gets in front of you, and she would be like that most of the day. And then all of a sudden the sky would break and she would have these incredibly lucid moments. And then I would talk to her, and one day she said to me, the people in Cuba that live there, they were born into a situation now. They didn't know any better. They couldn't leave, so they were basically programmed into a totalitarian system. Why should we continue blaming them for being communists? They have no better. They don't know better. And she came to grips with that. I have to tell you, many Cuban immigrants who, like us, had to leave have not been able to shed that bitterness. I'm not happy with what's going on there. I think it's terrible. But by the same token, we can't continue to hold grudges.
Yeah.
Because people are people, and there are a lot of good people that have kind hearts, and they've grown up in just crappy situations.
Well, when you have this situation, you have a handful of people that made the decision, the wrong decision maybe, for all the rest of the population. And as you say, they had to deal with it. So we can't just point the finger back to, and
no,
put
you can't.
Everybody under the same umbrella, because some people had, most of them, that didn't have anything to do with it. I don't think we mentioned that, but that was the period of the missile crisis, right?
When we left, yeah.
When you left, so
yeah.
I saw that in the synopsis of the summary of the book. It seems it's an important moment.
Yes, it is. It was a key moment because, I tell you the truth, Castro came on 1st of January 1959. We did not leave Cuba until 1963. So we were there for 3.5 years.
So you saw the 3 years of the beginning of that.
And we knew what was going on. At that time, my uncles who were in the United States, I had 2 uncles that were physicians, and they were trying to get the Red Cross to give us permission to leave. And finally, we were set to leave through Miami. The day was October 23rd, 1962. We were at the airport, Jose Marti Airport in Havana. We got out of a cab, we crossed the street, go in the airport, and there's all these militiamen. The place was closed, and they said, "Where do you guys think you're going?" And we thought it was a joke,
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're leaving for Miami today. I said, "No, you're not. President Kennedy put a blockade around. You either have to walk home or swim." And we were left there for about 6 months in limbo before we were able to leave. And we eventually left through Mexico, not through Miami. So I got to see that. I also, in 1961, they had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we lived 60 miles from the Bay of Pigs.
Mm.
And like I say, I'm not a political person. I was not political as a kid. But, kids see things, and they know when something is right and when something is not right. And I remember distinctly after the invasion took place that they captured all these prisoners. They hogtied them, and they put them in the back of pickup trucks. They were army trucks. And they paraded them up the main street in my city. I'll never forget that. I just was looking up, and all these people were shouting at them, saying horrible things. And these guys some of them were really young men. They were hogtied. They had mosquito bites. They were sunburned. They had bruises. And you could hear a big speaker with Che Guevara saying, "The traitors, they killed the traitors." And I never forgot that. It was just such an upsetting thing. And sometimes when I look at some of the film clips, like when the invasion of Poland and stuff like that, it's not in the same degree, but I can imagine how kids feel. They don't understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So that was tough.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you look at history. There is a lot of this situation, and then you get to your new country, something you look up, and then you find people that are not very welcoming, and because they simply probably don't even know what you're escaping from. And this is happening now too. I mean, we don't get political in this show. It's about storytelling, but I mean, stories are made because, again, of decisions and looking back. But I understand from all the things that you said now, all the remembering to forget and remembering to forgive, it makes more and more sense as you're sharing your story. I mean, obviously you get to that point that you needed to forget all of that and move on with your life. And
well, let me give you an example.
Yeah,
this is
please.
A perfect example. If you ask the majority of people who left Cuba around that time, and I'm talking the adults, many of them are probably in their 80s now and or dead, they would say Kennedy was just a miserable, horrible president for doing what he did, that he betrayed the Cuban people. And in fact, many of the Navy and Army personnel that trained to get that mission in Cuba resented the fact that Kennedy basically said, okay, you guys, you can't intervene, just kind of sit in the background. And for years, I had this seething anger towards President Kennedy. And I read a book called The Last 12 Days. And it was a book about what was going on with the missile crisis. I had no idea that here I was sitting in a town where not far from me there were nuclear warheads aimed towards Miami and towards the United States coast. I had no idea. And then when I started to understand what President Kennedy, the position he was put in, he inherited this. He had to make decisions. Do I feel regret that it happened that way? Of course. But he had to make the best decision for his country and for the American people. And I forgive him for that. I do. Because I've been in situations where other people have heartily disagreed with my decisions, but they didn't know the other side of the story.
Yeah, you gotta put things in perspective, because that was probably one of the closest moments we ever got to.
My gosh,
to a nuclear confrontation. And
when I think about the fact that I sat in that island, there were all these nuclear warheads being put together, I can't believe it.
Yeah, it was an important piece of history. But listen, Ricardo, I mean, I can stay here and listen to you I'm sure you have many more stories. I know you have stories about that you almost got mauled by a wild boar. I've read like these little pieces here, and
I don't forget.
Sure. Yeah, but I don't want to give away everything. I mean, I think we got a really good idea of what this travel, this adventure that you had, and a lot of philosophical reflection about what has been going on. So I think it's an interesting book that look at history and look at emotions and look at the need to move on. And so I suggest, obviously, people to listen to this. And of course, there'll be all the links in the notes for the book to get in touch with you. And obviously to, I don't know, get somebody else's perspective. Because unfortunately, in this world, especially now with social media, people tend to read the headlines and think that they understand the whole story. We retweet, we share, we hit that, and we're all guilty of not even knowing exactly what we're doing with the bubble of, of social media that they create around people that think the same way we do. And I think, and especially being someone that come from a different culture and you got to experience that you need to put yourself in other people's shoes, and you need to give the time to listen to their story and be open, because that person could have been anyone else. That situation could have happened anywhere else. And it's too easy to think that everybody in the world is in the same situation that you are. So if you can experience different culture, do it. And if you can't physically, I think that reading, watching movies, listening to stories that tell you the perspective from another place and another time, I think it's a good thing. As painful as it may be, but I think it's a good thing.
It makes us grow, though. It really does when you read about that.
Absolutely.
I was just reading about a fellow during World War II. His name was Nicky Winton, who was a stockbroker, and then he found out that it was just before World War II, and he helped evacuate I don't know how many children refugees from Czechoslovakia. It's a wonderful story. A lot of messages in there. So my book is basically a hope-filled book. I think that there are some ups and downs, and there's some areas where I get a little cynical and angry. Mm-hmm. And there are areas where I get really silly. So I purposely wrote it with short chapters, so that if you get a little sleepy, you can put it down and pick up the next. And the other thing is, I decided that I'm going to give the royalties to charitable organizations. I'm not trying to make any personal profit on this book, and I think of it as my way of paying it forward. So I really do appreciate talking with you. I hope we can talk offline after this program, because I feel like you said, you get to know people, and that enriches me personally. Every time I talk to somebody and I learn about their life, and I say how lucky I am that I can listen, that I can share with other people. We need to do more of that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the major pleasure that I have, on top of loving storytelling in any form. Like it's a song.
I have to tell you a story.
Yeah, go for it.
When we talked about the commonality of life.
Yeah.
As I was reading about you, I came across this story sotto la stella. And it's interesting, and I want to congratulate you for what you're doing with your mother, because in the book I write about this. My mother died, and she was a writer. And I found out 2 years after she died, my brother had a whole big box full of her poems and everything. And as you're fortunate to do now with your mother who's living and tell these stories for children, my mother left a trove of over 300 poems, short stories. And my next love is to maybe put together a book. It will be a little bit of a memoir, but around her work.
I think you need to do that.
So we'll both be writing, and she's looking over my shoulder. I know that.
I love that. I mean, think about how many people write their diary, write their thoughts, and they never get the opportunity to put it out there. And some people maybe don't want, but also nowadays it's a little bit easier to put things out there, put your thoughts. And the story sotto le stelle, it's a typical example of that, because I can translate it with ChatGPT. I can have artificial intelligence read it, because we have a podcast about that. And in the end, is it going to turn into a big book or a movie or a big podcast or whatever? I got to tell you, I honestly don't care. I think they're great little story. And me and my mom, we have so much fun doing it. It's like reconnecting something, and it's something I didn't even know for the longest time.
She's giving you a gift, and you're giving her a gift.
Absolutely.
And, it's terrific. I just think, for me, I'm going to write this one in Spanish because her poetry, a lot of it is in a rhyming fashion, and it's very difficult to really convey a rhyming. In Cuba, there's a very popular, it's called a decima, and it's actually become a street form of, like when people do hip hop and they rhyme and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Cubans were doing that in decimas years ago. And you go to the streets in Cuba and you will find people who do not know how to read or write. And they will tell you these rhyming stories. And what they do is they stand around and one guy will start talking about his wife and how beautiful she is and what a great cook she is. And then the other guy will respond saying, no, my wife is better cook.
And it's all in that
it's
rhythmic.
All in rhyming.
Oh, that's
it's
cool.
Incredibly,
I didn't know that.
Oh, and so a lot of the things that my mom wrote, they were stories. I mean, she writes about a hurricane. She writes children's stories about the little frog who lost its pond. And so I am just so anxious to just dive into that. It's like a treasure chest.
You know what? You do that, and then when you put it together, you come back and you tell me all about that.
I will take you up on that.
Absolutely.
I will take you up on that.
For sure. And I think it's something you need to do. I think it's going to be a wonderful trip for you to do.
I have to tell you a story about Ray Paul Johnson. When he and I were corresponding, I was talking about, I'm 74 years old, okay? I kept saying, well, I kind of see the end of the runway, implying that maybe that was kind of, we're all going to die sometime. And he wrote me back and he said, Ricardo, remember, the end of the runway, that's where flight begins.
And the guy is a pilot, so
yes.
he knows.
That, again, back to perspective. This is how he looks at it. It just made my month, my year.
I love it. And you know what? With that, we're gonna end this conversation with a promise to have another. And in the meantime, I want everybody, if they enjoy this conversation, if they find your story interesting, to actually get the book, read it. And the fact that you donate what you get from the book, it's an extra reason. But I think that in this conversation, there's been many pieces that if people want to understand what was going on at the time and the emotion connected with a refugee, I think they have to read this book. So I'm going to say goodbye to you. So it's a goodbye. I'm going to see you again very soon, and we'll stay in touch outside of the podcast anyway. And for all the people listening, to get the book, subscribe to Audio Signals, because as you can tell, nothing is script here, and we just open our veins and talk our heart. So,
Marco, thank you. It's just been a delight to chat with you. And to everybody that listens in on you, please do stick with them, because I think there's just some really fantastic episodes.
Thank you. Thank you. You be well too, and everybody be well. I'm going to call it off here.
Yep. The end of the runway.
The end of the runway, but it goes.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals Podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then take a moment to rate this show and add it to your favorite podcast player. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues. We invite you to come back for more stories and follow Marco Ciappelli on his social media as he continues musing on stories, storytelling, and storytellers.